There are relationships that don't just enter your life. They reshape it. They don't follow the rules you expected. They don't give you the comfort you thought love was supposed to bring. Instead, they awaken something deeper inside you. Your fears, your patience, your emotional limits, and your deepest questions about love and self-worth. Loving someone with avoidant emotional patterns is one of those experiences. It feels confusing, magnetic, and deeply emotional all at once. One moment you feel incredibly close, and the next, you feel distance so strong it almost hurts in silence. You find yourself questioning not just them, but also yourself. And without realizing it, this kind of love doesn't leave you the same. It transforms the way you see connection, attachment, and emotional safety. This is not just about loving someone who struggles with intimacy. This is about what that love does to you, how it shapes your emotions, and why you walk away from it as a different person than the one who entered it. At the beginning of this kind of connection, everything feels amplified. The emotional pull is strong, almost undeniable, as if something deeper than logic is drawing two people together. There is a sense of intensity that doesn't come from stability, but from contrast. Moments of closeness feel unusually powerful because they are not constant. They appear, disappear, and return in unpredictable waves. That unpredictability is exactly what makes them feel so meaningful in the early stage. When emotional availability is inconsistent, the mind starts to register even small gestures as significant. A simple message, a brief moment of attention, or a rare expression of warmth can feel far more meaningful than it normally would in a stable dynamic. This is not because the connection is necessarily deeper, but because scarcity changes perception. What is rare begins to feel valuable, and what is inconsistent begins to feel emotionally charged. In the beginning, there is often a sense of curiosity mixed with excitement. The emotional distance is not yet fully understood, so it can be misinterpreted as mystery or depth. Silence does not immediately feel like rejection. Instead, it is often explained away as independence, focus, or personality. This allows hope to grow alongside attachment. The emotional mind fills in the gaps with meaning, imagining that what is not present now will eventually become stable later. This stage can also create a strong internal focus on earning connection. Without realizing it, effort begins to increase. Attention becomes more intentional. Communication becomes more thoughtful. There is a subtle belief forming that if the right words are said or the right timing is found, consistency will follow. Emotional investment deepens quietly, not through dramatic events, but through repeated anticipation of closeness that sometimes arrives and sometimes doesn't. What makes this phase so powerful is the contrast between closeness and distance. When connection is present, it feels deeply rewarding. When it is absent, it creates confusion rather than detachment. Instead of stepping back, the mind often leans forward, trying to understand what changed. This cycle creates emotional intensity that feels like depth even when it is actually instability. Over time, this intensity becomes familiar. The nervous system starts adapting to unpredictability. Emotional highs feel higher because they follow lows. The bond begins to form not only through connection, but also through waiting, hoping, and re-engaging after distance. This creates a pattern where emotional presence feels earned rather than naturally given. And slowly, without clear awareness, attachment begins to strengthen. Not because everything is consistent, but because inconsistency has started to shape emotional perception. What feels uncertain becomes compelling. What feels unpredictable becomes emotionally stimulating. And what should have been simple connection begins to feel like something worth pursuing, analyzing, and holding on to. After the initial intensity begins to settle into a pattern, something quieter but far more impactful starts to take over: the internal questioning. This is where the emotional experience stops being just about the other person and slowly turns inward. Instead of only feeling the connection, the mind starts analyzing it. Instead of simply experiencing closeness and distance, you begin trying to explain it, understand it, and fix it in your mind. At first, the confusion feels small and manageable. You might notice a delay in response or a shift in tone, but you don't immediately assume meaning behind it. However, when this pattern repeats, warmth followed by distance, engagement followed by withdrawal, the mind naturally starts searching for patterns. Humans are wired to find meaning in inconsistency, so you begin connecting dots that may not actually belong together. A delayed reply is no longer just a delay. It becomes something to interpret. A short message is no longer just a busy moment. It becomes a question mark about interest. Silence stops being neutral and starts feeling loaded with hidden meaning. And this is where overthinking begins to take root. Without realizing it, your emotional attention shifts outward more than inward. Instead of focusing on how you feel in general, your energy becomes directed toward decoding behavior. You start replaying conversations, rereading messages, and analyzing tone and timing. Small details suddenly feel important, even when they may not actually carry meaning. This mental loop creates a constant state of emotional alertness. You are not fully relaxed in the connection, even in moments of closeness, because part of your mind is always waiting for the next shift. It becomes difficult to stay present. Instead of enjoying interaction, you are monitoring it. Instead of feeling secure, you are tracking signals. As this continues, your emotional world becomes increasingly centered around interpretation. You begin to assign reasons to behavior. Maybe they need space. Maybe they are overwhelmed. Maybe you said something wrong. Each explanation temporarily calms the uncertainty, but it doesn't resolve it. So the mind keeps searching for a more accurate answer, deeper analysis, or hidden truth. This constant analyzing slowly starts affecting self-perception. You begin to question your own role in the dynamic. If distance appears, you wonder if you caused it. If warmth returns, you wonder what you did right. Your sense of emotional stability starts depending on external behavior rather than internal grounding. Over time, this creates a subtle emotional fatigue. Not dramatic or loud, but quiet and ongoing. The mind becomes used to uncertainty, but it never fully relaxes into it. Even moments of connection are partially clouded by anticipation of change. And this is the deeper shift. Your emotional energy is no longer fully in the present moment. It is split between what is happening and what it might mean, between what is felt and what might come next. And in that space, overthinking becomes not just a reaction, but a habit that slowly reshapes how you experience connection itself. As the emotional pattern continues, something subtle but deeply personal begins to develop: self-doubt. It doesn't arrive all at once, and it rarely feels dramatic in the beginning. Instead, it grows quietly, almost invisibly, through repeated moments of confusion, distance, and inconsistency. Over time, the mind starts turning inward, not for clarity, but for explanation. And this is where the internal questioning of self-worth begins to form. When emotional connection feels unpredictable, the human mind naturally tries to find a cause. And because the behavior of the other person is inconsistent and difficult to read, the easiest place for the mind to search for answers is within yourself. You start asking silent questions. Did I say something wrong? Did I come on too strong? Was I too emotional? Should I have acted differently? These questions are not always logical, but they feel emotionally convincing because they give structure to uncertainty. It feels easier to believe that you are the variable than to accept that the situation itself may lack consistency. And slowly, this belief begins to shape your emotional state. You start adjusting yourself, not in obvious ways at first, but in subtle emotional shifts. You become more careful with your words. You think more before expressing needs. You try to match energy instead of naturally expressing your own. There is a quiet attempt to become easier to connect with, as if reducing yourself emotionally will increase closeness. But instead of bringing security, this creates emotional tension, because every adjustment is based on uncertainty, not confidence. You are not expressing yourself freely, you are managing yourself. And over time, this management becomes exhausting. The most painful part is that moments of closeness still exist, and when they do, they feel like confirmation that everything is okay. But when distance returns, it feels like something must have gone wrong again. This cycle creates emotional instability that slowly starts to influence how you see yourself. Your self-worth begins to fluctuate based on external behavior rather than internal truth. You may find yourself overgiving without realizing it. More attention, more patience, more understanding, hoping that consistency will eventually stabilize things. But when effort does not lead to emotional steadiness, confusion deepens. And instead of questioning the pattern itself, you begin questioning your role in it. This is where emotional self-perception starts to shift. You begin to see yourself as someone who needs to earn consistency rather than naturally receive it. And that belief is powerful because it changes how you approach not just this connection but future ones as well. Even your emotional reactions begin to feel like evidence. If you feel anxious, you assume you are too sensitive. If you feel uncertain, you assume you are overthinking. Slowly, your internal experience becomes something you doubt instead of trust. And this is how self-doubt takes root, not through one moment, but through repetition, through unanswered questions, through emotional imbalance that slowly trains you to look at yourself as the problem instead of recognizing the dynamic as the source of confusion. As the emotional experience continues to unfold, something important begins to shift beneath the surface. You start learning emotional restraint. Not because you planned to, and not because you wanted to, but because the experience itself teaches you that not every feeling you express is received the way you expect. Not every moment of closeness leads to more closeness, and not every effort leads to stability. At first, you may still try to respond naturally, expressing yourself openly when you feel something deeply. But over time, repeated experiences of emotional distance after moments of closeness begin to create hesitation. You start pausing before you speak. You start thinking twice before you reach out. You begin to measure not just what you feel, but how it might be received. This is where emotional self-regulation becomes more intense than usual. You begin to control expression not because you lack emotion, but because you are trying to avoid emotional discomfort. You start holding back reactions that once felt natural. You start filtering your needs through the possibility of being misunderstood, ignored, or met with distance. Without realizing it, you begin adapting to unpredictability. You stop expecting emotional consistency and instead start preparing for emotional shifts. This preparation becomes a habit. You learn to lower expectations not because you don't care, but because caring too openly has started to feel risky. There is also a growing awareness of timing. You begin to sense when it feels safe to express something and when it might lead to distance. You become more selective with communication, not out of indifference, but out of emotional caution. And slowly, this caution becomes a part of your emotional personality. At the same time, you begin to notice something deeper. You are no longer reacting immediately to everything you feel. There is a gap forming between emotion and expression. In that gap, you start observing yourself. You notice how often you want to reach out, but choose not to. You notice how often you want clarity, but decide to stay quiet instead. This internal observation slowly builds emotional discipline. You start learning that not every urge needs action. Not every uncertainty needs immediate resolution, and not every emotional wave requires a response. But this restraint comes with a cost, because while it creates control, it also creates suppression. You are still feeling deeply, but expressing less freely. And over time, that internal pressure can build quietly. Still, something important is developing underneath it all: awareness. You begin to see patterns more clearly. You start recognizing that your emotional energy is not always being met with the same consistency. You begin to understand the difference between patience and emotional self-abandonment. And even though this realization is gradual, it becomes powerful. Because for the first time, you are not only feeling the relationship, you are analyzing how it affects your emotional behavior. You are no longer just inside the experience, you are also watching how it changes you. This is how emotional restraint forms, not as a choice, but as an adaptation. A quiet response to inconsistency that slowly teaches you how to hold back, observe, and protect your emotional energy in ways you never had to before. As the emotional experience deepens over time, something fundamental begins to shift inside you. Your attachment system starts to change. This isn't a conscious decision, and it doesn't happen in a single moment. It develops gradually through repetition, through emotional inconsistency, and through the quiet realization that closeness does not always guarantee safety. At first, you still want connection in the same way you always did. You still value closeness, attention, and emotional presence. But after experiencing repeated cycles of warmth and distance, your nervous system begins to adapt. It starts to associate emotional closeness with unpredictability. And when the mind links connection with uncertainty, it naturally begins to protect itself. This protection doesn't always look obvious. It doesn't mean you stop caring. Instead, it shows up as emotional caution. You begin to hold a part of yourself back even when you are engaged. There is still warmth, still interest, still emotional investment, but it is no longer fully open or fully free. Something in you is always slightly guarded, always slightly aware that distance may return at any moment. You also begin to develop emotional independence, not because you necessarily want to, but because you have learned to rely less on consistency from others. When emotional availability feels unpredictable, you start finding ways to stabilize yourself internally. You begin processing emotions alone more often. You stop seeking immediate reassurance as frequently as before. And slowly, self-reliance becomes part of your emotional identity. At the same time, your standards for emotional access begin to shift. You become more selective with where you invest your energy, not because you are less open to love, but because you are more aware of emotional cost. You start noticing patterns earlier. You recognize inconsistency faster, and instead of ignoring it, you begin to respond to it differently. Sometimes by stepping back, sometimes by observing longer before engaging deeply. There is also a quiet change in trust. Not necessarily a loss of trust in people, but a more careful approach to emotional vulnerability. You no longer give full access quickly. You test consistency over time. You observe behavior more than words, and you allow connection to build gradually instead of instantly. But perhaps the most important shift is internal. You start understanding your own emotional limits more clearly. You become aware of how much uncertainty you can handle before it affects your peace. You begin recognizing when you are overextending emotionally and when you are protecting yourself appropriately. This awareness becomes a form of emotional intelligence that you didn't have before. And yet, even with this growth, there is complexity. Because while emotional guarding protects you, it can also create distance. You may find yourself less open than you used to be, more careful than you expected, and more reserved in situations where you once would have been fully expressive. This is the paradox of transformation in such experiences. You become stronger, more aware, and more selective, but also more protective. And that protection, while necessary, becomes a permanent part of how you approach connection moving forward. You don't lose your capacity to love, but you stop giving it freely without awareness. You begin to understand that emotional safety is not just something you receive, it is something you learn to recognize, evaluate, and choose. After going through the emotional cycles, the confusion, the self-doubt, and the gradual internal shifts, something deeper eventually begins to surface, a moment of clarity. It doesn't arrive suddenly like a revelation. It builds slowly through exhaustion, awareness, and emotional reflection. It comes after you have replayed enough moments, questioned enough patterns, and felt enough emotional inconsistency to finally step back and see the experience as a whole instead of fragments. At this stage, your mind begins to separate feeling from truth. You start recognizing that intensity is not the same as stability. Just because something feels powerful does not mean it is secure. Just because moments of closeness exist does not mean consistency is present. And just because emotions are strong does not mean the connection is balanced. This realization often begins quietly. You might notice that your emotional energy has been disproportionately invested in understanding, waiting, or adjusting. You begin to see how much of your attention was spent interpreting behavior instead of simply experiencing connection. And in that awareness, a shift begins to form. For the first time, you start asking a different kind of question, not, how can I make this work? But is this emotionally sustainable for me? This shift in questioning marks a turning point. Because now, the focus is no longer just on the other person's behavior, but on your own emotional well-being within the dynamic. You begin to understand that love should not constantly feel like decoding. It should not require emotional uncertainty as its foundation. It should not leave you in a state of continuous anticipation, waiting for clarity that never fully stabilizes. And this understanding slowly changes how you interpret past experiences. Moments that once felt meaningful begin to look different. You start seeing patterns instead of isolated events. You recognize cycles instead of singular gestures. And with that recognition comes emotional detachment, not coldness, but clarity. The emotional grip of confusion starts to loosen because you finally see the structure of what you were experiencing. This is also where self-awareness deepens. You begin to reflect not only on what you experienced, but on how you responded. You notice where you overextended yourself emotionally. You see where you ignored your own needs in favor of maintaining connection. And instead of blaming yourself, you begin to understand yourself. That understanding becomes powerful because it transforms regret into insight. You stop viewing your emotional investment as a mistake and start seeing it as a learning process. You realize that your depth of feeling was never the problem. It was simply placed in a dynamic that could not consistently hold it. And slowly, acceptance begins to form. Not necessarily acceptance of the situation itself, but acceptance of what it taught you. You begin to value emotional consistency more clearly. You begin to prioritize reciprocity over intensity. And you begin to understand that emotional peace is not found in chasing clarity, but in recognizing when clarity is absent. In the end, this stage is not about forgetting what happened. It is about integrating it. It is about carrying forward the awareness that love without emotional steadiness can reshape you, but also teach you. And from that teaching, you begin to approach connection with more awareness, more self-respect, and a deeper understanding of what emotional safety truly means.